Well, most of you know that we've been gone for a couple weeks on a vacation. We traveled to North Dakota on vacation, 4,200 miles in 2 weeks, but we only actually traveled 9 days of driving because we spent some time with our daughter in Dayton. So it was a lot of driving. One of the days, the longest day, we drove 850 miles, which is a very full day. You might wonder, why did you decide to go to North Dakota? Why did we go to North Dakota? Because North Dakota is the only state in the continental states that we've never been in. So we decided to drive all the way there just to say we had been there. Well, once we visited there, we learned a number of things. The first thing we learned was why we had never visited there. There's not a lot there, and everybody we talked to told us there's not a lot there. And we found that to be the case. Now, I want to be careful what I say. We are broadcasting this over the internet. I would hate to be single-handedly responsible for a dip in North Dakota tourism, but I don't think there will be. Really, North Dakota, except for the southwest corner, is very fascinating. It has an area called the Badlands, very similar to the Badlands of South Dakota, but not quite as good as the ones in South Dakota. But it was interesting to visit. But for the most part, what we discovered about North Dakota was that it was just flat. Huge fields, flat, corn, soybeans, canola, everything. And then we decided to pop up into Manitoba and Saskatchewan because we'd never been to those two provinces in Canada. And so we thought we'd just do a threefer. And so we got those two. And everywhere you go is just as flat as can be. It's kind of that way in many other places we visited, but the flatness seems to be more pervasive. The fields are, in my home area of Scott County, Indiana, is a lot of flat land. And, you might see fields that are 200 acres or so. Those are big fields. But up in Manitoba, there were fields that I swear they looked like they were 1,000 acres. They were huge fields. We were visiting a store in Manitoba, and my wife got talking with the clerk there in Manitoba, and she was kind of making fun of the people over in Saskatchewan. Now, I don't know how in the world she had the guts to do that, because Manitoba and Saskatchewan are very similar, but she was describing Saskatchewan as being a place where you can watch your dog run away for 3 days. That describes to you how flat it is. It was interesting to see, although to some degree you've seen one field, well, you know what I mean. We also learned in this visit to North Dakota to always have a map, because if you wanted to find a place to run away during the time of trouble, it may be North Dakota. There's no cell phone service in much of the state, only when you get around the cities. And so if you try to do something with GPS, it just goes shh, little circle, shh, shh. There's no GPS, so it's a good thing to have a map. I also learned from being in North and South Dakota that I kind of like driving 80 miles an hour legally. It's kind of fun because then you can kind of push it a little bit higher, as we do, no matter how high the speed limit is. So we were going about, well over 80 miles an hour. I kind of like that without having to keep looking in my rearview mirror. I also learned the hard way that County Road 8 is not the same as State Route 8. Because we were following State Route 8, and we saw 8 turn, and so we turned, but it was County Road 8. Bad idea. We got totally lost on mud roads and on gravel roads that night. I actually had to take my car and wash it. It was so filthy dirty. We were totally lost. There was no GPS. I finally stopped at one of the oil fields there and found someone and found some directions to actually get out of there and get back to where we wanted to go. And it reminded me of this text, which goes along with what I want to share today. It's Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12. Actually, I'm just going to read it to you. It's a familiar text to you. It says, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death." You know, had we not got directions, we could still be lost on those roads of North Dakota all this time later. And so it's good to know that the road you're on is the right road. There's one other thing I did learn in this trip. It is a very good thing that I have Candace to be my navigator, because I would probably spend much of my time lost if the GPS doesn't work. It was interesting to be there. It's frustrating to be lost, and all of you have been lost on some road at some point in time, but ultimately you get there. But it seems to me, and I was thinking as we were lost and as we were driving these large distances, how much more essential it is spiritually to be on the right road. And I was thinking about this text, and so I kind of wrote this sermon on those long stretches of long straight highway. This text of Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14, which we just read, but let me read them to you again. Matthew 7, 13 and 14. It says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few." Now, if you read the King James Version, the King James Version may leave you with a little bit of a misunderstanding, because it says at the beginning, "Straight is the gate." And the word straight, S-T-R-A-I-T, which I didn't understand for many years, is an Old English word for narrow. That's why the more modern translations say narrow. S-T-R-A-I-T means narrow, not S-T-R-A-I-G-H-T, which is straight as an arrow. That's not what the road necessarily is, although it probably is. But the word straight in the King James means narrow. Now, it's interesting that this passage in Matthew 7, 13 and 14 is only in Matthew. You know, lots of times passages have parallels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called the synoptic gospels. You see with the same view. But this passage is only in Matthew. And it's in what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus points out that there are only two ways. One leads to eternal life, and one leads to eternal death. Now, it was interesting to be studying for the sermon and reading in commentary on the book of Matthew by George Knight. And he points out something interesting that I'd never seen before. The Sermon on the Mount ends with not just the two roads, one wide and one narrow, but if you continue reading on, Matthew 7, 15 through 23 also has two things. And it's summarized in verse 15 by saying this: "So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit." And when you read the passage, you understand it's not really talking about trees. It's just an illustration for good teachers and bad teachers. And so you have not only two ways, one that leads to life, one that leads to destruction. You have two kinds of teachers, one that will lead to life and one that will lead to destruction. And then you have the end of the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 7, the end of it. It also has the two foundations. One is the foundation of sand, and one is the foundation of rock. One foundation will lead to life. One foundation will lead to death. So you have three parallel passages in the end of the Sermon on the Mount telling us that there are only two ways. Only two ways. Now, Jesus is telling us that there is no middle ground. It's not possible to sit on the fence. And he's really responding to some Old Testament passages, reflecting them. Let me just share with you real quickly these three passages. Deuteronomy chapter 30. Moses is talking to the children of Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 15. Moses says this, "See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil." Drop down to verse 19. "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life that your offspring may live." Jesus is reflecting this idea of two ways. One is the way to life, one is the way to death. Joshua chapter 24, verse 15. Joshua reflects the same idea. Joshua 24, verse 15. You know this text. Joshua speaking to the people and says, "And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord," and here's the famous part, "choose ye this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your father served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Only two choices. Only two choices. Jeremiah 21, verse 8. Jeremiah 21, verse 8. Jeremiah is speaking to the people for the Lord. It says, and to this people you shall say, "Thus saith the Lord, behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death." Jesus is doing the exact same thing in the Sermon on the Mount. There are two ways. One leads to life, one leads to death. So let's read it one more time. Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14. Jesus says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is wide and easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few." There could not be more contrast between these two ways. One has a gate that is narrow. One has a gate that is wide. One has a way that is difficult. One has a way that is easy. One has a way that leads to life. The other leads to destruction. It says that the first gate, only a few people will find it. But the second gate, how many? Many. Many people will be on that path, on that way. And so because there are two paths, how many kinds of travelers are there on the two paths? And you might think the easy answer is two. But let me suggest to you that there are actually four kinds of travelers on these two paths. Four kinds of travelers. Let me tell you. The first path we're going to talk about is the broad way, entered by the broad gate. Notice that the gate is broad. It can let anything whatsoever enter. There is no limit to the baggage one may take in, whether that baggage be physical baggage or other kind of baggage, personal baggage. This doesn't matter. The gate is wide and the way is wide and easy. In this way, you have to leave nothing behind. There are no restrictions. Do anything you want. It doesn't matter what you believe. Every belief is equal value. There's no belief you have to stand up for. Every belief is of equal value. Those who are walking on the broad way, it's a permissive way. There's no such thing as sin. There's room for anything and everything. And everything is equal. Lifestyle does not matter. Anything goes. Anything of a sexual nature is accepted. Anything goes. Marriage is not necessary. How do you feel is the most important. It's easy to get on this path. It's easy to stay on this path. It requires nothing but the natural way that you want to do anything. Now, without sounding judgmental, I'll suggest to you that if you want to see this path, go sit on the street corner of any city, Hagerstown. Go sit at the mall on a bench and watch people walk by. Do you ever like to people watch? It's very fascinating, almost disturbing. But you go to a mall, you sit and watch people go by. Most of the people you see walking by are on the broad way. Now, lest you say to me, you're being awfully judgmental, aren't you? Well, let me remind you that Jesus tells us how many people will be on the broad way. Many. Many. It sounds like there will be more, and it's very plain, there will be more on the broad way than on the narrow way. So I think it's safe to say that if you just go and sit and people watch, most of the people you see are in this flow of traffic down the broad way, enjoying life to its fullest, doing anything they want. And yet the sad thing is that it leads to destruction. The second travelers on these two ways are those that are on the narrow way. The gate is narrow. I think it's interesting to think about the gate being so narrow that you can only enter this gate one at a time. Now, why do I like that idea? It's because this is the gate that leads to salvation. And every single one of us has to take the step through the gate to salvation individually. It is not possible to be saved in groups. Every single one of us has to make an individual decision to follow the narrow path, to enter at the narrow gate, and to follow Jesus. I think it's possible. I think it's possible to be lost in groups. That might sound strange, but it's possible to be lost in a group because you don't think for yourself. You're in the flow of traffic. You know, everybody's doing it. I remember when my sisters were young and we were living at home, I wish I had a penny for every time they told my mom these words. But everybody's doing it. Yes, to which my mom would reply, well, if everybody jumped off a bridge, would you? Which I always thought was a silly question or silly answer. But anyway, I think it's possible to be lost in a group because you're just going along with the group. It's peer pressure. But it's only possible to enter the narrow gate and walk the narrow way individually. But the good news is, as we'll see more in just a few minutes, the good news is that when we walk the narrow way, we don't walk it alone because Jesus walks it with us. That's the good news. Now, the narrow way is not a popular way. It's a difficult lifestyle. Those who are walking on the narrow way may be made fun of sometimes for being repressed or having too many restrictions. This is especially true of young people who are trying to follow Jesus, and other young people make fun of them. But that happens for adults too. This is not the popular way in the world. And I will suggest to you that it becomes harder and harder to stay on this road as temptations in life become more and more accessible and easy to find. This is not the easy path. Jesus is very honest. He says the way is hard that leads to life. But it's possible because we're traveling it with our best friend, with Jesus. But here's the sad thing. It says, few will find it. Few will find it. It's a very sobering thought. Now, of course, I know we're a group far above average here, right? Far above average. But if you apply what Jesus says to this church family, it says that many of us are on the broad path that leads to destruction. And only a few of us will be saved. It's very sobering to think about our brothers and sisters who we love in this congregation. To think that there will be some here who are not saved. It's very sobering. The third group of people are those who think they are on the narrow way, but really aren't. This is a group of people who, that Proverbs 14:12 text comes in here. There is a way that seems right to a man, but the end is the way of death. You know, there are people, I've met them and probably you have too, people who consider themselves to be good Christian, people who consider themselves to be good Seventh-day Adventists, but they're not living the kind of lifestyle that will get them through the crunch at the end of time. They're not living the kind of life that shows that they love Jesus more than anything else. They're not living that kind of life. They think they are. They might admit, that I'm not quite as close as I wish I was. Perhaps they're walking on the edge of the narrow road. Not down the middle of the narrow way, on the edge of the narrow way. I don't want to become fanatical. But I'm okay. Especially, we say we were talking about this in our One Accord group last night. I'm pretty good when I compare myself to everybody else. Think they're on the narrow way, but in actual fact, they aren't. They just happen to be going in the same general direction as those who are on the narrow way. But they're not really walking with their best friend, Jesus. They're described in the book of Revelation as being self-deceived. Revelation chapter 3, verse 17. You've heard this text. We studied it in our One Accord group last night. These are people who say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing. And that's not talking about their physical lives. It's talking about their physical lives and their spiritual lives. I'm rich, I'm increased with goods. I don't need anything. And there are people that live their spiritual lives like that. But, Jesus continues in verse 17, but not realizing that you are wretched and pitiable and poor and blind and naked. There are people that think they are on the narrow way, but they're just playing church. And we need to pray that God opens our eyes so that we see if we're one of these people. The fourth group of travelers is similar to that group, but they're very different. The fourth group of travelers are those who are on the broad way, and they know they are. But they try to act like they're on the narrow way, especially when they're around people from the church and the pastor and their parents. Do you know what I'm talking about? Now, the difference between these people and the ones right before, people number 3, the third traveler, is that they think they're on the narrow path. These people know they're on the broad way. And they realize that, but they act like they're on the narrow way when they're around somebody that wants them to be on the narrow way. I spent much of my teen years as this kind of traveler. You know, I was the young man that everyone was proud of. You know, I was the young man who, at 15 years old, was elected by the church nominating committee to be the leader of the youth Sabbath school class. And I was barely youth, but I was the youth leader, Sabbath school leader. I wanted people to think I was on the narrow way, but I wasn't really. Because when I was with my friends, I was a totally different person than when I was with the adults. My mom, especially my mom. You know, when I was this age, my mother, when I was a teenager, my mother never, ever heard me swear. Or as we put it back in those days, cuss. You know what I mean, right? My mom never heard me cuss. But my buds did. My buds knew that I could cuss just with the very best of them. I had a really dirty mouth. But my mom never heard me swear. It's almost like I had a little switch in my brain. When I was with my mom, it was switched off. She never ever heard me. But when I was with my buds, it was switched on. I think there are many people living this kind of double life. They are on the broad way, but they act like they're on the narrow way. It's really not surprising when these people, especially when they get away from the people they're trying to act all goody two-shoes with, when they get away from them, it's really not a surprise that they fall out of their relationship with the church and with Christ. Because they have been walking with him for years. Just acting. Play acting. Not authentic Christians. Pretenders. They used to have this phrase, talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. There are these 4 travelers, those who are on the broad way and enjoying it. Don't care about the narrow way. And then there's the second group, those who are walking on the narrow way, and it's hard. The third group, those who think they're walking on the narrow way, but they really don't, they really aren't. They're not really walking with their best friend Jesus. And then there are the fourth group, those who are walking on the broad way, but pretending that they're on the narrow way. Those are the only 4 travelers I can think of. And the truth is that every single one of you is one of those kind of travelers. Every single one. Which one are you? Which one describes the way you live your life best. When you look at the direction of your life, which characteristics seem to fit you in the best way? As I was thinking about how do we get on the narrow way, how do we follow the narrow way, it struck me that Jesus told us how we needed to do that. In John chapter 14, verse 6, we find the secret to walking on the narrow way. John 14, verse 6. John 14, you know, is the passage where Jesus says, I'm going away and I will come again. It's a famous Adventist passage. Verse 5, Thomas says, Lord, where are you going? How can we know the way? And here's this wonderful truth. Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I am the way. Jesus is telling us that if we want to be on the narrow way, the only way we can be on the narrow way is to follow him. And it has to be a total devotion to him. I'm not saying that we won't mess up and we won't fail sometimes. But is your life devoted to him? We were just visiting our daughter last week, and she is 8 months pregnant. You know, I have a rule of thumb. I never ask a woman when she's due. Never ask a woman when she's due, because what if she's not? You know what I mean, right? So I never, but when you look like my daughter does, it's okay, it's safe to ask, because she is so obviously pregnant. So obvious. I wonder if we are so devoted in our lives to Jesus, if it won't be just as obvious to people. Because you cannot be a little devoted any more than you can be a little pregnant. Devoted. Following the way, on the way, the narrow way. And you know, have you ever realized that the earliest name for Christianity, the earliest name for Christians was the way? That's what Paul knew it as. He says when he's going to Damascus, he's going up to catch those who are of the way. They're following Jesus the way, on the narrow way to the city, to heaven. It's interesting, the first vision that God ever gave to Ellen White uses this theme of the narrow way. It's an interesting vision. If you'd like to read it, it's in the book Early Writings. It's the first chapter in Early Writings. It's quite a lengthy vision. And I want to share just a little bit of it with you this morning, but it's a very lengthy vision. It's a vision that Ellen White received, her first vision, in December 1844, 2 months after the Great Disappointment. The purpose of the vision was to encourage the Advent believers because of their great disappointment. And it was to encourage them and to show them that everything they had believed was not an error. And so it was a very, very important vision. As I say, it's in Early Writings. And I want to read just the first paragraph of this vision. And I want you to see this theme. Ellen White is gathered in a private home with about 5 women who are having a little prayer meeting. She writes this: while I was praying at the family altar, the Holy Ghost fell upon me, and I seemed to be rising higher and higher, far above the dark world. I turned to look for the Advent people in the world, but could not find them, when a voice said to me, look again and look a little higher. At this I raised my eyes and saw a straight and narrow path cast up high above this world. So you see, here you have this imagery of Matthew chapter 7. On this path, the Advent people were traveling to the city, which was at the farther end of the path. They had a bright light set up behind them at the beginning of the path, which an angel told me was the midnight cry. This light shone all along the path and gave light for their feet so that they might not stumble. If they kept their eyes fixed on Jesus, who was just before them, leading them to the city, they were safe. But soon some grew weary and said the city was a great way off, and they expected to have entered it before now. Did you ever feel that way? I felt that way traveling from Medora, South Dakota to Des Moines, Iowa. It seemed like we were never going to get there. It's a long way off. Get weary. But soon it says some grew weary and said the city was a far way off, and they expected to have entered it before. Don't you feel that way about heaven? Then Jesus would encourage them by raising his glorious right hand, and from his arm came a light which waved over the Advent band, and they shouted, "Alleluia!" Others rashly denied the light behind them and said that it was not God that had led them out so far. The light behind them went out, leaving their feet in perfect darkness, and they stumbled and lost sight of the mark and of Jesus and fell off the path down into the dark and wicked world below. You have the two paths. You have the narrow path. You have people falling off the narrow path, and obviously they're falling to the broad way. You have the Advent believers walking toward the holy city, the city of God. Now, this vision was especially meant to encourage those who had gone through great disappointment and who were walking on the narrow way. And the path that shone from the beginning, the symbolism of that was that what they had gone through had been significant. God had led them. It was light. But this passage not only is talking about them, it's talking about us, because we are on the same narrow way, walking toward the same holy city. Every single one of us need to be on that path too. And how can we stay there? Did you see that? Did you see the secret of staying there? Did you pick it up when I read it? It was earlier in the writing. Did you pick it up? It's on the first page. It says this. What's the secret of safety and staying on the narrow way? She says this. If they kept their eyes fixed on Jesus, who was just before them, leading them to the city, they were safe. They were safe. How? If they kept their eyes fixed on Jesus. You know, there are so many things around us in this world that want to distract us. So many things, so many ads calling out for our attention. So many politicians wanting us to buy what they are selling. So many things that call for our attention. And for those who are on the narrow way, we can't live above them, but we have to live beyond them. Because there is only one thing that deserves our attention. Now, I'm not saying this is easy. That's why it's called the narrow way, which is hard. There's only one thing which deserves our attention. If they kept their eyes fixed on Jesus, they were safe. Sing with me. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things